What if I told you that one of the most terrifying weapons of World War II wasn't a bomb, a tank, or a bullet? What if the most devastating weapon was a silence so profound, so enforced by shame and fear, that it hid one of history's largest-scale war crimes for nearly half a century? This is not a story about battles you can find on a map. This is a story about a war waged on the most intimate frontiers of the human body and spirit. It's a story about a calculated, bureaucratic system created by the Imperial Japanese Army, designed to enslave, torture, and break hundreds of thousands of women. And today we break that silence. To understand the depth of this atrocity, we must first understand the machine that created it. Following the invasion of Manchuria in 1931 and the full-scale outbreak of war in 1937, the Imperial Japanese Army swept through China with devastating speed and brutality. Cities fell. Villages were razed. And in the wake of this conquest, a problem emerged for the Japanese High Command, a problem they saw in cold, logistical terms. Mass rapes by soldiers were causing several issues. The spread of venereal disease was crippling military effectiveness, the violent acts were fueling even fiercer resistance from the local population, and the international community was beginning to take notice of the army's lawlessness. Their solution? Not to curb the violence of their soldiers but to systematize it. Thus, the comfort women system was born. The term itself is a grotesque euphemism, designed to mask its true nature. This was not a volunteer service. It was a network of military-run brothels or comfort stations, populated by women and girls who were forcibly taken, deceived, or purchased from their families. It was a state-sponsored, industrial-scale system of sexual slavery. And Chinese women, along with Koreans, Filipinos, and others, were its primary victims. Estimates suggest that at least 200,000 Chinese women were ensnared in this hell. For a young woman like Mei Ling, a name we use to represent the thousands, the war was a distant rumble. Her world was her family, her village, the simple rhythms of life. But the war had a way of finding the peaceful places. The abduction methods were varied, but their outcomes were always the same. Some, like Mei Ling, were taken in violent raids. Soldiers would surround a village, round up the young women, and load them onto trucks. Others were deceived with promises of work in factories or as nurses. They were told they could serve their country and earn money for their impoverished families. It was a lie. The moment they stepped onto that truck or into that barracks, they ceased to be people. They became property of the Imperial Japanese Army. The journey to the comfort stations was itself a torture. Packed into dark, airless cargo trucks or train cars, with no food or water, the women were disoriented and terrified. Many were raped repeatedly by the soldiers transporting them. This was the first stage of their dehumanization, a deliberate process to break their will before they even reached their final destination. Upon arrival, the women were processed like livestock. They were given medical inspections not for their well-being, but to check for diseases that could be passed to the soldiers. They were assigned numbers. Their real names were erased. They were housed in squalid, cramped rooms, often no larger than a closet. This was their cell, their workplace, and their prison. The daily routine was a relentless cycle of horror. The day would begin with a soldier banging on the door, shouting their number. Number 23. Your first customer. The women were forced to serve dozens of soldiers a day, sometimes 30, 40, even 50. There was no rest. There was no refusal. Resistance was met with immediate and extreme violence. The torture was multifaceted. It was physical torture. Beyond the relentless rape, beatings were commonplace. Women were burned with cigarettes, whipped with belts, and cut with bayonets for showing resistance or emotion. Malnutrition and exhaustion were constant companions. Medical care was non-existent. Infections, internal injuries, and rampant venereal diseases were left untreated. Psychological torture. The constant humiliation was a weapon. They were forced to perform degrading acts. They were told they were worthless, that they were public toilets for the army. They were isolated from each other, though the sounds of other women's suffering were a constant, haunting chorus. Many were forced to witness the murder of other comfort women, who tried to escape or protest, a grim warning of the consequences of defiance. Reproductive torture. Pregnancy was a common and terrifying outcome. Many women were forced to have abortions, often performed in brutal, unsanitary conditions that led to death. Others who carried to term had their babies killed or taken from them moments after birth. This systematic approach is what distinguishes it from random acts of wartime violence. The Japanese military created a manual, a set of rules for managing these stations. It detailed pricing, hours of operation, and hygiene procedures. This bureaucracy of abuse demonstrates that this was not the work of a few rogue soldiers. This was official policy, sanctioned at the highest levels. When the war ended in 1945, the comfort stations were disbanded. The women were simply turned loose. But for them, liberation was not a celebration. It was the beginning of a new, different kind of prison. They returned to a world that did not understand their trauma, a society where the stigma of sexual violation was often placed on the victim. Many found their families had been killed in the war. Others were rejected by their own relatives, seen as soiled and shameful. They carried deep physical scars, infertility, chronic pain, disabilities. But the psychological wounds were even deeper. PTSD, crippling depression, and a silence born of shame became their lifelong companions. They buried their stories not because they forgot but because the world made it clear it did not want to hear them. For decades, their suffering was a hidden chapter of the war, a secret everyone knew but no one acknowledged. But silence cannot hold forever. In the 1990s, spurred by the growing women's rights movement, the survivors finally found their voice. Led by incredible courage, elderly women began to speak out. They formed support groups. They filed lawsuits against the Japanese government. They were not asking for money, though compensation was part of their legal battle. They were asking for three things: a formal, official apology from the Japanese government, the acknowledgement of historical fact in Japanese school textbooks, and most importantly, for the world to know what happened to them, to validate their suffering, and to ensure that such a crime against humanity never, ever happens again. The response from Japan has been complex and for the survivors, largely unsatisfactory. While some leaders have expressed apologies and remorse, the government has often obfuscated its legal responsibility, citing treaties and a desire to move forward. This ongoing denial is, for the survivors, a continuation of the violence, a violence of erasure. So, we return to that silence we began with. We now know it was the sound of a secret being kept, the sound of a world looking away. But today that silence has been broken. It has been replaced by the sound of courage. The shaky but determined voices of elderly women, speaking truth to power. The sound of historians uncovering documents. The sound of activists marching in the streets. The sound of our own conscience demanding that we listen. The story of the Chinese comfort women is one of the darkest chapters of the 20th century. It is a story of unimaginable torture, both physical and psychological. But it is also a story of survival, of a resilience of the human spirit that defies comprehension. These women endured the unendurable. They lived with the unspeakable. And then, in the twilight of their lives, they found the strength to speak, so that others would not have to suffer their fate. They are more than victims. They are witnesses. And their testimony is a legacy for all of us. It is a warning about the depths of human cruelty, and a testament to the unbreakable power of the human will. To forget them is to commit a second injustice. To remember them is to honor their struggle and to take up their cause. A cause for truth, for justice, and for a world where no woman ever has to endure what they did. Their silence has ended. Our responsibility to remember has just begun.